Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today, we are once again joined by Hans Lander of the Myth of the 20th Century podcast. Hans, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well today, Scott. I'm glad you don't have Hank on here, and I want my doppelganger here too. Really, I have ego problems, so can't have Hank on the same show.
Yeah, we'll see what the commenters say. You know, the commenters have a lot of opinions about who should come on. I was seeing in the last episode, there are comments demanding Blep Sama back. Of course, Nightmare Vision has his own fan base out there. Surprisingly enough, we've been asking Nightmare Vision, but I think he's retreated to his forced seclusion lately. So we'll have to wait till maybe after the election to have him on again. But we've got a lot of topics today, or really just one really big topic that's going to give us a lot of time to talk about, namely the Amy Coney Barrett hearing. Trump's replacement for RBG is expected to sail through confirmation and be put on the Supreme Court by Election Day. The hearings are about what you expect. Democrats grandstanded with giant photos of all the poor people who are going to die if Obamacare is repealed by the Supreme Court. And they also attacked ACB for not being RBG, which apparently to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you had to be exactly like her, which surprisingly, Amy Coney Barrett is not. True to form, ACB talked a lot about her kids and mostly gave generic answers to the Democrats' stupid questions. Hans, what do you think of the hearing so far?
Did you see the woman that was criticizing ACB for wearing a dress?
Yeah.
This is a common thing now.
Yeah, I was like a frumpy lawyer who's like, you're supposed to wear a suit. Like, why are you wearing this dress?
Maybe she should borrow Clinton's like Moo or Chairman Mao outfits from 2016. I mean, that's how I look at it so far. I've been paying some attention to it, and first of all, it honestly seems like the Republicans are throwing her some real softballs. And at a certain point, like, I get it. You have the votes and you're trying to throw softballs to humanize your pick. And it kind of calls into question, why do we even have hearings then? Because if you have the votes, and they wouldn't have put her up if they didn't have the votes, if they weren't confident in this thing. Why are we even indulging hearings? It's not like there's any Democrats that are going to vote for her. It all seems like this kind of bygone, formalistic process. And I honestly wish we would just get rid of it. If you have the votes, why don't you just vote and then confirm her and then be done? It's like this opportunity for Democrats to show how psychotic they are. Like with, what's that guy's name? Sheldon Whitehouse, where he had the signs that he kept putting up on the podium. They kept falling over. It's like a Mr. Magoo sketch. It was so bad. And you got to think, why are we indulging this anymore? It's just like it's like entertainment for senior citizens.
Absolutely, and it's just political theater. I mean, Democrats, all their answers, I was watching some of it at the gym yesterday, and Mazie Hirono, who's one of the most odious representatives in Congress that we have, it's some really stupid Japanese woman who, anytime she's actually had to address like a serious intellectual question, she's shown to be just stupid, but she's just arrogant and demands to rule authoritatively and just demands total obedience from anyone she asks. But she's just such an idiot. And when she was up there, she's like, ACB, you don't, Miss Barrett, you don't seem to take into consideration how your rulings will affect real people. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg took her decisions by seeing how this would have a real world impact. And you don't care about people. And by the way, when you're up there, you have to be totally neutral. So they imagine this dream Supreme Court justice as just going up there. And once they put on the robes, they have no political opinions, no biases. They're just out there to help, the poor people that they have blow up posters of that they're showing off. But otherwise they're totally neutral. They've never had a bias in their life. They're no prejudice. There is this almost, Anglo-Saxons have been really into this idea of an objective, impartial judiciary. It's one of the cornerstones of our democracy in our country. And it's been twisted even to our day when clearly we see that our justices have severe biases, severe prejudice. To think that the justices are going to act neutral is totally silly. I mean, and it hasn't even really happened at any point in American history. But we like to maintain this myth, and it's an ideal we strive for, and it does keep some of the corruption at bay. But otherwise, like, they really still believe this myth that, oh, Ruth Bader Ginsburg just happened to be very neutral and objective, and somehow it supported all of our policy initiatives. But that's just her looking at this objectively. Like, you don't look at this objectively. And so they got their one-liners in and they asked stupid questions. I think you made a really good point about Republicans asking softball questions. I don't think they asked any questions of importance. All their questions were of a nature such as Ted Cruz asked, is like, what advice do you give little girls today? And she's like, well, anything boys can do, girls can do better. I was like, boom. Liberals' minds are exploded. They're like, conservatives can't have strong women. No, they can't be feminists. Like, liberal heads, you could just see them exploding.
You could see the TPUSA. You could see the TPUSA meme being made in real time during.
Yeah, the satellites, outer space satellites, were picking up the liberal meltdown. And this is like this. I mean, one of those questions, we'll touch on this a little bit, is that it really does show that, like, conservatives are imagining ACB as the female Kubla Khan, like going through and like slicing through liberals and really upholding social conservatism. But that statement is said by every cultural entity in the world today, or the Western world today, that like girl power, like we saw all this in the 2019 USA women's soccer team that we all had to suffer through and act like that this is a real sport and that they're the greatest athletes on earth.
Well,
girl power is like
super chill Scott Greer. Have you considered that this is all just politics and she just has to say it to get ahead? I mean, I know that that's a refrain people have, and I honestly kind of agree with it. I mean, the reality is she's being accused very frequently of being part of a Catholic sex cult or whatever, right? And that's how it's framed. And I think from her point of view, she has to try and do or say whatever's necessary to kind of humanize herself or normalize herself. I'm assuming that she's actually probably a fairly normal person in reality and probably doesn't really think like that her daughters can do everything better than her sons. But, you know, and you have to play these games and you have to deflect from all the Catholic cult, I guess, accusations, then sure, you should say whatever you can to get ahead. I mean, I don't really think it's that bad. I would say that honestly, they've been criticizing her because I guess she made some kind of legal ruling that, you know, saying the N-word to one of your employees at work does not qualify as racial discrimination. So I know that they're trying to set the stage for some kind of accusations of racism next, because the Catholic cult stuff didn't really stick because she seems too nice and affable to be like a cult member the way they were making her out to be.
Yeah, there's a couple of points I would address with that. The one with the N-word ruling is that was asked to her by Cory Booker yesterday. And actually looking at the case is that the plaintiff, when he was bringing forth his suit, he didn't mention the N-word usage in his complaint of all the expletives that they were saying in his workplace. And so it was a technical argument on her part that the reason why they ruled against the plaintiff is they're like, well, you didn't put this in your lawsuit, indicating that you likely just made it up on the whim in order, knowing that your case was flimsy. So they ruled against him. And Cory Booker brought this up in the case. Is like, well, Brett Kavanaugh ruled on a similar case and found it is workplace harassment and workplace intimidation. And her response is just a technical matter and saying that, like, well, in the actual case, the plaintiff didn't put this in their actual complaint, and it was only much later that they mentioned it. And there was a dubious grounds with it. I don't think they're going to stick with the racism angle. I do see that, like, yes, you have to play politics. You're not going to go up there and be like, this is a white man's country. Why are you addressing me, Hirono? Get out of here, Jap. It's not like going to be like somebody like that. It's, we've got to have.
It's not going to be like Sinead from Renegade Radio back in the day.
Yeah. Or something like that. White genocide.
The earth is flat too, you goddamn jabber.
And it's like, when you ask me to condemn white supremacy, all I have to say is, why is it Africa for the Africans, Asians for the Asians, but white countries for everyone else? Yeah, she's not going to say that. And even her response that there's some, I think it was maybe Dick Durbin or one of the Democrats asked her, is like, can you condemn white supremacy for me? And she's like, sure, I condemn white supremacy. That was like her playing the part. Like, we don't expect her to, go on some long rant about how this is a stupid question. She just gave it.
Is anyone actually going to say, no, I don't? I mean,
yeah, no, I don't. Like, what is she supposed like that? I understand is playing politics. And even like one question is Josh Hawley, who's supposedly the great national populist hero, asked her, was like glowing over her multiracial family. And like, this is so great. This means you can be in the Supreme Court. And how is this going to impact you? And she actually was better than Hawley in this one situation. And she said, well, it's, it's not going to impact my decision. But she made other comments indicating that they would impact her decisions or definitely influence her outlook on policies and issues that are going to come before the court. I think her statement on this, anything boys can do, girls can do better, it's really cringe. But it's probably not the worst thing in the world. I mean, it is such a basic thing. And I don't think with her responses that she's necessarily, and it definitely getting to the point of whether she's just a normal soccer mom and she's just giving that point, is that is typifying a lot of the conservative feminism you see, especially in conning circles up here, is that there's all these women who are like, I'm a strong conservative woman and I hate how the Democrats say I can't be one, and I can have 7 kids and have a successful career even though I'm not married and I have no kids and I'm like in my mid-30s, but this is all going to happen someday. I'm going to be just like Amy Coney Barrett. And they do uphold Barrett as this mythical ideal of how you should be a conservative woman, is that you're both a career woman and you have 7 kids. And even her family, it looks like it was like engineered in a Heritage Foundation lab. Like, she has 2 adopted Black kids from Haiti. She has her youngest child has special needs, which conservatives really like, for whatever reason. That's like always like, they always like to put that in there as well with the family that's being engineered in a heritage chemical lab. Not necessarily think this is a negative thing, even though we'll get into the transracial adoption aspect in a little bit. She is what these, junior staffers at Heritage Foundation want to see themselves as, even though they can't accomplish that due to, ACB, of course, got married early. She's generally way more intelligent than the average person working in conservative, probably more intelligent than almost all people working in conservative. And she, but I'm not sure how she manages to be, a federal court judge and having 7 kids, but I leave that to her to answer.
Far more attractive. I mean, I honestly think.
Also that as well is that, most of the junior staffers are frumpy looking at 24, and this woman, Amy Coney Barrett's 48 and is still very attractive for not only just for her age, but in general as well.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at, I was making this point to a group the other day, even in, a lot of European countries or just a lot of countries around the world, there are female politicos in various positions, whether they're judges or just straight up politicians or whatever. And generally, they're actually very attractive. Like, there seems to be a standard in most of the world. Like, if you are going to be female and you are going to step up to the plate.
Yeah, like Angela Merkel. I'm like, damn.
Oh, come on now. But other than the frumpy Teutonic Krauts over there.
No, I understand, especially
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
right.
I mean,
Like Giorgia
the
Meloni is very hot in Italy. The Le
Yes.
Pens were always good looking.
The woman who was running Finland, Blep's country, is fairly attractive. I mean,
yeah,
so generally there's this approach to politics, like the females are generally good looking, and there are other. I think the leader of AFD, she's fairly attractive, and she has kids.
she's but actually she's a lesbian, and
Wait, what?
Yeah, no, she's a lesbian, and her partner is like a South Asian.
What? All right, I retract that statement.
But she's also like okay with like the more right wing of the party. Like there are two like there's a lot of division. I mean, this is a slight diversion, but AFD has two co-leaders. They have this old German boomer, Alexander Vollen, who's like pretty stereotypical conservative right wing, and then they have her. I forget her name. And then I think I actually may have gotten his name wrong, but they have the two co-leaders, but within that party, they have these moderate cucks who are just like, we're EU skeptics. We don't care about that much immigration. And then in the East, they have these far right, they're not really far. They're what we want. They're like strong nationalists who want immigration restriction and a strong Germany. And she tries to appeal to that. So she's not, I wanted to say her name is Alice Weidel.
Okay, maybe I'm thinking of a different.
All these names are coming to me. I'm probably and I feel like the party leader's name is Golan, but showing my like bad memory. But anyway, this is their ages. But yes, in Europe they have a lot of these, particularly in the nationalist parties, they are using towards women. And even before these two took over, there was a fairly attractive woman who was leading AFD and was seeing the shift away from libertarian Euroscepticism to, populist nationalism. But she left the party after their big election victory, I think in 2016 or 2017, because they're just too right wing, even though she helped usher in this new nationalist AFD. She left, but Giorgia Meloni in Italy is now becoming a rising leader and challenging Matteo Salvini as the great leader of Italy. The Le Pens, both Marine Le Pen and Marion Marshall in France. I think even in Norway, the right-wing party, which is much more libertarian, is led by a woman. And so in a couple of other places as well. And one of the highest ranking leaders in the Law and Justice Party is a woman as well, but it's totally controlled by this older man, this like 70-something bachelor. But there is this like capable women leaders. I actually think in America that it's much harder for someone like a conservative woman of a nature like Marion Le Pen or Giorgia Meloni to actually emerge. Is that the average woman who's in Republican politics who rises up to a leader, someone like Joni Ernst, an otherwise like hapless woman who always seems like she doesn't know what's going on, and she doesn't really like criticism, and she's always like hopeless. She's like, can you please stop attacking me? Or Martha McSally is another example. There's these kind of like weak like women who don't really have any policies, and they're always squishy. And when they're really put, have pressure exerted on them, they totally fail. You couldn't imagine them like leading the Republican Party. And the female leaders who are rising up are totally horrible. Like Liz Cheney is horrific. Nikki Haley, of course, is terrible. But Nikki Haley's not even really a leader. She's just a psyop that they keep pushing on us. She's the new Marco Rubio, but even dumber, but a little bit better looking. So that's a little bit in her regard. But
generally, I think Barrett is. I think my point was like Barrett is just, when you look at just the people that she's talking to, none of these people are attractive. Hirano, Kamala, Klobu Charmander, whatever her name is. They are like deeply unattractive people. And you look at
Klobuchar is
Klobuchar. Yeah,
she's like the evil opposite of what the soccer mom is. Like
yes,
like Amy Coney Barrett is the one who's like got all the supplies ready. She knows what the other kids want, and she's like, you better finish that. And everyone's like, yeah, we love Mrs. Barrett. Well, Amy Klobuchar is the one who like tries to come over to be your friend, but all she does is scream at you for not playing the game right. She's like, what are you guys playing? I'm cool. I'm down with that. And then she's like screaming at you for not playing the video game right or beating her in the video game.
She's like a Scooby-Doo villain. I mean, you expect like her to rip her face off and there to be some reveal that it's like the local, I don't know, like weirdo or something. It's pretending to be the school marm and torturing kids.
Yeah, and also she like forces everyone to laugh at her jokes. Like you could tell because she had all these horrible canned jokes she would bring on the campaign trail, where she had this one where it's like, "Hey, did you hear Trump made fun of my hair? Well, I tweeted out, this is really funny, that I would like to see your hair in a blizzard." And it's clearly that she surrounds herself with people who have to laugh at these jokes and have to entertain her and be like, that's really funny. And so she keeps saying that. She reminds me of some of these in elementary school. We had these school ladies who would always like lead us in like chants she heard from a commercial. Like there was this popular, I think it was a Mazda. It was like a Zoom Zoom. And that was like a popular commercial. And she would always demand that the whole lunchroom go along and sing and do this Zoom Zoom. And she would just force them and she imagined that we all enjoyed it, but none of us enjoyed it. And there was one day where she's like, "Hey kids, Zoom Zoom." And no one said anything. And then she banned talking for the rest of the lunch hour. And that's who I think Amy Klobuchar is that she imagines that everyone's laughing with her and they love her and she's getting all this adoration. And they think she's just so funny and smart. But anytime that someone bursts her bubble and calls her out on bullshit, she lashes out violently, which is why all her staffers report her, throwing staplers and being extremely abusive comes out, because she's ultimately a petty tyrant. And this is the typical woman who rises up in Democratic politics. It's not a motherly figure like Amy Coney Barrett, who you would admire and respect and enjoy their company. It's just somebody who is viciously moving up the ladder. And if somebody tries to, at least challenge them, they lash out violently.
Yeah, I mean, I'm imagining like a Juche, Minnesota, and instead of that stupid flag that on the Unfamily has, where it's like the paintbrush and the mining pick and the whatever, just like a comb. It's just 3 combs intersecting, and the whole nation has to eat their salad every day with their state-approved combs, and we all have to listen to Klobuchar jokes for 3 hours on the television every morning. That's what I'm imagining. Whenever I think of Amy Klobuchar, that's what I think. I think of like a perverse inversion of a Midwesterner, and instead it's like this Skeletor, who's like school marming you every day for 3 hours a day and making terrible jokes, and deeply unattractive. And so whenever like I see these people, and if you look at, I don't know, Schumer's wife or Sheldon Whitehouse's wife, or these guys are married to the most unattractive women on the planet. And I guarantee you, like when they go home at night, their wives are just grilling them. You need to be tougher on her. She's a horrible bitch. You have to be tougher.
She's like in her 3rd glass of wine, and she's like, "Rachel Maddow told me that Russia is like controlling our potted plants," and something like that. And she's a horrible school marm. And like Amy Klobuchar inspires deep revulsion. I mean, maybe just because like she definitely reminds me of these like elementary school petty tyrants, and the example
more so
I
than
gave.
Warren ever did. Like, but I never even knew who the fuck Amy Klobuchar was before the election, the primaries started. And I always thought like Warren was the cat lady, the school marm of America. And then Klobuchar came on the scene, and although she failed at pretty much everything else in politics thus far, she did succeed in out school marming Elizabeth Warren. She did kind of take over that title, which is pretty incredible.
I think Warren, maybe her personal life, maybe just semi-normal. Like nobody really complains about like Warren's like personal behavior, besides that she's a total snake and she has no real principles. I mean, she is like,
and her husband doesn't live with her.
Okay, well maybe that's like that's all you need to know. I'm surprised. Amy's husband lives with her. But yeah, it is a good point that like when Republicans put out their candidates and their people, it's like Kristi Noem and Amy Coney Barrett, and they're these very healthy looking moms. They're healthy looking moms who are attractive, who you would want to be friendly with, and they do not strike you as cold-hearted bitches or as horrible, hideous school marms that are going to lecture you and force you to do whatever they say. And if you disagree with them, they're just going to have a meltdown. And Klobuchar definitely was the most repulsive candidate in the Democratic primary. So I think and Trump definitely understood this, and this is why he picked ACB. I think there was much better candidates who he could have trusted to enforce an America First policy. Bridget Beatty, who is a more typical looking middle-aged woman. She's not ugly or anything, but she's just more typical middle-aged woman. She's very much stronger on immigration. She, of course, doesn't have adopted Haitian children, and by people who've met her, they say she's 100% solid, and she even supported Trump in the 2016 primary, something very few conservative intellectuals and conservative lawyers involved in the Federalist Society did. Well, I'm pretty sure Amy Coney Barrett voted for Egg McMuffin, Evan McMullen, rather than Trump, based on some of her statements where she said that you couldn't really trust Trump to enforce or to enact socially conservative policies or appoint socially conservative judges, which, irony of ironies, he's now appointing her to the court. So, yeah, I think Trump definitely understood that she's like a potential star. She has a star power, and conservatives really love her in a way that they haven't, admired a judge in a long time, even though they did go crazy for Neil Gorsuch. But I'll get into Gorsuch and other conservative, the judge strategy in a moment. But if you look at this hearing, returning to your point that, she's just playing politics, I think there's two statements that show a little bit more than that. And the number one statement is how she responded to being asked about George Floyd's death. And when she got up there, there's a generic response that could have been said. All Republicans have given pretty much terrible responses on George Floyd, with the exception of Tom Cotton, who pretty much just said, yeah, it's bad, but I'm more worried about riots. And then Trump in early June at some press conference saying George Floyd is looking down and is so proud of our economic numbers, which just trivializes George Floyd. He's like, Floyd's up there. He's just so proud of these numbers and the jobs returning.
I'm glad we've stopped talking about George Floyd, because it was getting to a point where I just wanted to claw my eyes out every day, like thinking about it, where the golden casket and the Wakanda burial was, pretty over the top. But I think all this stuff about like Trump saying he would be proud of our black unemployment rate or whatever. It's like, oh my God, Donald, just stop.
I thought that was hilarious. I thought it was one of the best Floyd responses, because it absolutely trivializes the whole thing and turns it into a joke, which is it should be. But with Amy Coney Barrett, unfortunately, did not do these responses. Even with the generic, like, it was terrible, but we have to, I support our justice system, and I'm going to let the law play out. She gave this long story bringing in her adopted kids from Haiti and saying, like, oh, I remember this was very personal and very painful for my family. As the mother of 2 black children, this is very, very personal to me, and it causes a lot of pain. And she recounted how her and her daughter Vivian wept together over this, and she realized that Vivian's sons, when she has children, and the adopted Haitian son could all be the next George Floyd, and racism is a persistent problem in our society, and we have to do more to address it. But even though these were all terrible statements, she did come short. And when Dick Durbin was saying something about systemic racism and doing something about it, she's like, well, this can't impact the judicial system too much, and I don't want to give my own statement out of it. But with the first part of her statement talking about weeping over George Floyd and how this could happen to her own children, and how she believes that racism is a persistent issue in our country, this does indicate that the adopted kids are going to have an influence over her policies is that, one day, she could be ruling on something that's race related and her kids come in crying and they're like, this affects me. And there's just so much racism and I could be hurt and oppressed by this. Will you please do something about this, Mom? And she could be and very well be influenced by this. And of course, justices are influenced by outside matters. They're not going to, even though the myth is that what they put on the robes, they're just looking at the law and the facts. That's never been the case. And this was her response on the George Floyd thing, I think, was besides Greg Abbott declaring like a state holiday for George Floyd and saying it was the worst thing he's ever seen, even though he's around 60 years old and he's old enough to remember the carnage from Vietnam, 9/11, several horrible hurricanes that have devastated his state. And he felt that a convicted felon ODing on fentanyl was the worst thing he's ever seen. That was probably the worst. That was probably the worst response. I would say this is second. I think this was worse than Nikki Haley's response because nobody else said that they wept. And then they said that this could happen to my kids among prominent Republicans. So this does indicate something about her that not necessarily this is something we could trust. Also, her kids are immigrant children as well. So this could impact her immigration decisions. If there's something about refugees and maybe Haitians are involved in this, she could say, well, as the mother of Haitian children, I feel deeply impacted by this and I just can't rule against the Haitian refugees. And there is, a Haitian refugee case that's going through the courts that Trump, or rather Haitian migrants, where Trump removed temporary protected status for them and is supposed to deport them, but there's still legal issues over this. This is something very well that the Supreme Court could hear. And her own family could influence.
What is the American elite's fascination with Haiti? I've never understood it. Is it just like the ultimate charity case or what? It's
well with her. I think she wanted 7 kids. Like she was automatically committed to 7 kids, and the only way she could have gotten 7 kids was by adoption. And some people are wondering, like, well, why don't they adopt here? And well, it's very hard to find like white children to adopt, and generally, when you're adopting here, you're almost in a lot of cases it's very tough, and also you're gonna maybe adopting like the worst of the worst kids that like there's nobody around for. I mean, most people are adopted or taken care of by their relatives or somebody in their community. If it's in here, they've been completely abandoned. Not necessarily their own fault, but that's going to be very difficult for most parents, and most parents are uncomfortable with that prospect of raising, say, a kid from inner city Memphis versus raising a kid from Uganda or Haiti.
Right.
And so they automatically picked. So they went to Haiti. I guess it was like the easiest way to find an adopted kid, and that's what they went with. So yeah, but I mean, even though she told Josh Hawley that this wouldn't impact her decision, I think her George Floyd answer said otherwise. The other bad, really incredible moment that is much more worrying than her statement about anything boys can do, girls can better, or her condemnation of white supremacy, was her having to apologize for saying sexual preference, which this is just in a very new offense that was just invented literally yesterday, where she said something in the context of gays and saying that, oh, yes, their sexual preference. And later on in the court, somebody informed Mazie Hirono that Kyle Griffin, of NBC news producer, who somehow emerged, it was almost a major fixture in 2016 and 2017. He would always have the finger pointing down. It'd be like Barack Obama tweeting something. It's like, President of the United States. Like his own Twitter followers had no idea that Barack Obama is the President of the United States. Finger down emoji. He would always do that, and that's what he became popular for. But he insisted that sexual preference is offensive to gays because it's not a choice. They're born like this, and you must say sexual orientation. And Mazie Hirono demanded an apology from Amy Coney Barrett for this, and Amy Coney Barrett apologized to, in her words, the LGBTQ community for the hurt she may have caused. And I think that totally undermined her as this cultural warrior who strikes fear into social liberals. And the fact that she would apologize to the LGBTQ community for saying sexual preference, and somehow that's an offense, even though it was just intended as an offensive term the day of the hearing, and her just immediately capitulating, caving in. Now, it's tough to say what the proper response could have been, and should have just said is, well, I didn't mean any offense, but sexual preference and sexual orientation mean the same thing, and I'm sorry for giving offense to anyone. You know, it could have been said that, but like the way she said that, it was a really over the top thing, like saying to the LGBT community, even using that term is like a surrender to social liberals. And, you know, it's like you imagine this woman is going to, some people imagine she's going to bring about the integral estate, but here she is apologizing for saying sexual preference to the LGBT community. It's like, what?
Well, as we all know, a lot of those integralists online are probably part of that community themselves. But
yeah, that's very true.
So I'll say that they do use these, and this is why I was in the beginning questioning why we even entertain this anymore, why the GOP entertains this if they have the votes. They use these events, being the Democrats and just, you know, these opportunists in general, to further their own causes and to create new battleground tactics in real time. And so they did it with Kavanaugh, with all of the women must be believed. They tied it into all the Me Too stuff. And it's gotten to the stage where now under Barrett, they're trying to create this broader understanding that's mandatory amongst Americans. All sexual preferences are actually not preferences or choices. They are like an ingrained part of who you are. You're born this way. And just like that, that becomes like the new cultural battleground. So I think that in the future, the Republicans should be very cautious of even, again, indulging this stuff. They should just push it through. And they shouldn't allow the Democrats to behave this way. And they should have stood up for her in the Senate, you know, in the hearing. They should have said, no, she doesn't have to apologize. She doesn't have to apologize. She didn't mean any harm. Like, why are you making her apologize? They need to just grow a backbone and not allow these sort of rhetoric creation tactics to take hold every time we have a hearing on whatever. I think it's just kind of pathetic on the part of the Republicans. They can't like put up a fight against this stuff. And I know that there are multiple Republican senators who are in the closet in one way or another. And okay, but they need to still step up and try and combat this a little bit, because just like that, the Democrats basically tried to normalize that people are born gay, and that's just accepted fact. And Amy Coney Barrett is against facts. Like, this is a fact now. This is news to me. I didn't realize we had settled this. But just like that,
and the time frame of like 2 hours, they settled this without a debate. And I think, I mean, with that exception, Republicans are defending her and pushing her through. I mean, the hearings are just a formality. They already know the result. The Democrats know that they're defeated. They can't destroy her. And even I was like wrong about this. I thought that the Democrats would make serious hay over her issues on abortion and what they like to say, women's health. But they even seem to be incapable of doing anything about that. So they're just sticking to their usual talking points and trying to trip her up on systemic racism and other topics, but it's not really working. And they know that this whole thing is, you know, it's already written what's going to happen. I mean, she's going to get confirmed. There's nothing they can do about it. They can't find a rape accuser or somebody who has records of her saying the Nword. So they know she's going to sail through, and they're just trying to score some rhetorical points in it. But I think they're not even trying to connect to the election. They're not really mobilizing their base around these hearings. And even compared to Kavanaugh, of course, was a major cultural war, and it was a major event in our society. But with this, they're not mobilizing anyone. I think Democrats are just content that they have this election in the bag, and they're like, whatever, we'll have Barrett through, but we're going to pack the court when Biden wins. So who cares? Whatever. We'll let our senators try to get their, 15 minutes of fame for saying some stupid comment and, attacking her, and we'll just move on. So
well, that seems to be like the point of the U.S. Senate. I mean, I think Chris Christie said it best, I don't know, 5 years ago at this point, when he was kicking the shit out of Rubio on the debate stage. He accused him of being a robot. But he basically pointed out that when you're in the U.S. Senate, you're just there to blow off steam. And you're just there to, talk shit, and you're not really there to make any big decisions. The U.S. Senate has been reduced to this very strange body that is basically, there to make political careers and there to make, these big, beefy statements, because you don't do a lot of work as a senator. You're not involved in a lot of the big decisions. It's like the illusion of power. And so I think that the Dems, they use these goofy senators, and I swear all of their senators are just the goofiest people you can imagine, to start these new culture war initiatives randomly. By the way, it's just random. And they try and create political careers out of it. I mean, I remember Booker's "I am Spartacus" moment, which was, like pure cringe moment. But that's just what the Senate has become. It's become like a place for you to say weird stuff. And, it was just as bad with the Republicans under Kavanaugh, with Lindsey Graham yelling and pretending to be really angry and incensed. I mean, the theatrics of it are getting old, and they're going to have to find a way to keep it fresh and interesting. Otherwise, I think people are just going to tune out, and they're not going to be interested in every year we have another set of theatrics. It was novel back during Thomas, Clarence Thomas.
Yeah.
It was novel then because no one nothing like that had happened before. It was insane. And Bork too was kind of insane. But now it's every year or two, and it's not always just on a SCOTUS pick. It's on some other issue. Like every year or two, we have some big blowout in the Senate, and it's like a movie scene. It's getting over the top, and I really start to question, what is the point of the U.S. Senate anymore? It doesn't really have a great functional purpose.
Well, the Senate's acted like that for the last 60 or 70 years.
Yeah.
I mean, McCarthy, you could have made the same arguments about McCarthy, and of course Watergate, and they like this. I mean, it's the nature of cameras, and it's almost and to run a modern presidential campaign. The reason why it's so heavily full of senators is because governors are just too busy acting like a CEO or a manager, and they don't really know how to address the public and go with these theatrical moments that are good for TV. They just kind of sit along and they're running their business, and usually they're engaged in a lot more compromise than your average senator, while your senator is engaged in partisan warfare 24/7, and this makes them more fit to run for office in our era. So it is what it is. We're going to see a lot more of these stupid hearings. I think this hearing's even before the rape accusation against Kavanaugh. I think that hearing was more had more gravitas and was more serious than this. This is just like theater, but it's like half-ass theater that nobody even really cares. They know she's going to get through, and it's a before election, and our country's mind has become more rotten and warped by Trump that partisanship is baked in the cake, and it just is what it is. But moving on to the last topic on Amy Coney Barrett herself is the question of transracial adoption. Now, a lot of people have had opinions about this. Conservatives, of course, love it because they're very into transracial adoption, and this is a way to stick it to the libs when you're like, you say I'm a racist? Well, what about my black kid? And then they're like, no, I'm the real racist because I can't accept black adopted kids. And there were a lot of liberals who were criticizing Amy Coney Barrett for transracial adoption. They were calling it a form of colonialism. I think Ibram X. Kendi, the 90 IQ whiz of anti-racism, was making this point, and that this is like subsuming Black identity into whiteness. These like technical arguments about it. Well, conservatives like, haha, look, they're the real racists. Like you can't say this. You have to love these Black adopted kids. And a lot of people on the right, of course, have been queasy about it, but some have tried to suppress those thoughts. I've heard some people say like, well, she has 5, biological children that are hers, and it's whatever. This is an act of charity. And when we don't want to necessarily be like sit on our high throne and be like, this is the most evil act, but there is something profoundly weird and off-putting about this, and this does add a twisted dynamic to your family when you introduce kids who are totally foreign and then you pretend that they're just like your biological children. And I saw this throughout my high school. I went to a high school that was full of white evangelicals who loved adopting kids outside of their community, and many of them were Black. And there was one family in particular that really loved highlighting this 6-year-old Black child that they had just adopted. I think he was American. He wasn't from Haiti or Africa. And they would always take him around and show him around school. And it almost was like a pet that they had. They were like, look, I'm not racist. Look, he's like on my shoulders. He's hanging out. He's having a good time. We even had a Black History Month. Now I'm blanking on the term. This is how bad you are with, sometimes you get so old you forget terms. We had a Black History Month event where everyone just came in, and the whole school's there, and we have to learn about Black History Month, even though I went to like a overwhelmingly white school with very few Blacks. So they had to like find any Blacks to go up there to educate us about Black History Month. And there was one time the evangelical family went up there. Well, just the son went up there with the adopted Black kid, and he was like on his shoulders, and he was literally making like monkey sounds on there and doing like waving around. It was like very dehumanizing for the kid. And he's like, when I hear people saying racial slurs and saying racist stuff at our school, I've got to say, hey man, you're talking about my little brother. And then the little brother would wave, and they're like, yeah, and everyone's like, woo. And by having this kid and you're introducing it into your family, it's added to, you're making your family accept a lot of the anti-racist dogma and critical race theory and all this stuff that's put out by the liberal elite. No matter how conservative you are, you're eventually accepting in this outsider who is going to say like, well, this hurts me. Like, why would you believe this? Like, affirmative action is good because it helps people like me who come from nothing have an advantage in life. And this will impact your whole family dynamics. And I think it is her family, she already had 5 kids. I mean, she already was well above the average. And there are so many ways you can contribute charity, besides adopting a child. And she was just so set on having 7 kids that she was committed to, going to adoption to accomplish that. Nothing wrong with wanting to have 7 kids, obviously. And it's a misplaced charity when there are so many problems within our country and our community that you're just going outside. And I think I was saying this before, is that it's much weirder for, that family to adopt, a kid whose parents were OD'd on meth and they come from Appalachia, and he's like, not been in good health because no one's taking care of him. It's much weirder for them to adopt an orphan from, a meth baby from Appalachia, or even an inner city kid from Memphis, versus just going totally outside of the country and adopting a Haitian and then bringing it here. And then it's used as a pet and as a deflection from racism accusations. And even this kid becomes the main obsession that's all they talk about. I mean, if you look at David French, the first thing you'll ever hear about David French is that he has an adopted Black kid.
Doesn't Mitt Romney have a adopted Black kid?
He has an adopted grandson. I mean, he has such a gigantic family. There's 1 adopted grandson, and like liberals attacked him for saying that this is like the pet of the family, and they're like, this is racist. This is like a controversy in like 2013. But yeah, he has one. And David French, of course, has one, and this is all he talks about. And that black child, before Trump, he was the most right-wing writer at National Review, who's for immigration restriction. He defended the Confederate flag. He was extremely anti-Black Lives Matter. But now, with the Trump effect and him getting strange new respect from liberals, he's turned into a total cuck. I don't even think he's opposed to immigration restriction now. He believes like all Confederate monuments should be torn down, and he's embarrassed of his Confederate ancestors. And he obviously is pro Black Lives Matter. And he always attributes this to the adopted black child. So even if you're necessarily, adopting them for, good and charitable reasons, this is going to have an effect. And it's very popular among more so evangelical Christians, even though Amy Coney Barrett is a part of a Catholic group that emulates a lot of evangelical practices. I don't think many Catholics are into this. Actually, I was talking to Nightmare Vision, our favorite, and he was saying that, coming from his white ethnic communities in the Northeast, that pretty much everyone there would find it very weird if somebody adopted like an Haitian child, and they would be like, what the hell is this?
Well, it's
what are you doing?
strictly a way of signaling class sophistication and wealth. Yes. And it's this kind of wicked paternalism that is becoming more and more common, not necessarily amongst evangelicals and Catholics and so forth, but a certain subset of classes in America. And they're using religion to justify or mask it. And Barrett's just as guilty of this. She comes from the upper echelons of society. She certainly participates in it with her career and so forth. And so this is a way of just signaling that you are even more part of that class, that you're really imbibing it into your personal life. You are adopting people from the third world. And it's very odd. And I think a lot of people find it very strange because there are quite a few people in America, or children in America every year, who go unadopted and wind up in the foster system, which is horrific. They wind up in shelter systems. They have to live with dysfunctional family members and so forth. It's a very common tale. And instead of helping those people, we're going to help people who we assume are in worse circumstances halfway around the world. And a lot of the times, these children are being adopted from their families. And it's very strange. The families are effectively giving them up.
Yeah.
And it's a sale of transfer, effectively. What a lot of these people won't admit to in this country is they are buying children to raise as their own. It's very bizarre. Instead of going through the adoption process here with someone who's underprivileged, and they can be of any race, and quite frankly, a lot of the kids who are up for adoption are having, a tough time in the foster system. They're not even the children of drug parents. A lot of the times they're, single moms, teenage single moms is probably, I think, still the most common cause. And, they give up the kid. And instead of helping those people out, they want to participate in this sale of transfer, where they go overseas, they go on this adventure to find the baby that they want, like it fits their exact vision in their mind, like the platonic ideal. Then they buy it and they bring it back. It's very strange. It's very bizarre. Several people in the American elite, as I said earlier, have done this with Haiti. They've done it in general with Africa. And I guess if you can't afford to do this through Africa, or you don't want to take the risk, you do it through the inner cities in America. But ultimately, it's the same thing. And I think that, when the Russian government banned or at least restricted most adoptions to the United States, they had a good point in that many of the people who were adopting Russian children were from the American upper class. They noticed a certain amount were homosexual, which is very odd, but they were from the American upper class and thus had no intention of raising their children as Russians. They would have been raised as debutante upper class Americans.
Yeah.
And thus reduces the total Russian population in the world. And so at some point I'm waiting for these countries in Africa and Haiti to look at it in a very similar way and to say that you're actually taking away our future people. You're removing those people from our culture, from our demographics, and you're going to turn them into kind of strange American shitlibs with a guilt complex or a guilt-making complex. These people are going to create guilt in your mind, even though they are probably adopted by white people with over $1 million in a bank account and are given a private school education. Because they're an adopted Black immigrant, they will guilt you to death and claim that you're racist. So I think that honestly, it's going to get worse and worse. And I do not understand why the American upper class is doing this, other than it is a way of showing that you are loyal to that class and that you are in with the trend. And the trend is you literally buy children to raise instead of having them or adopting them from circumstances in the United States.
Yeah, exactly. And, now moving on to the last topic dealing with ACB, I think, we've covered pretty much most of the things with Barrett herself, is the whole strategy with conservatives and judges. And conservatives obsess over judges, but they can easily disappoint. Movement conservatives hailed Neil Gorsuch as the true successor to Scalia. I think a lot of people forget about how crazy they went over Gorsuch in 2017. And they continued defending Gorsuch as the greatest judge ever up until the summer when he read gay and trans privileges into the Civil Rights Act. And he sucked then. I mean, he had a terrible immigration record then. He was like, oh, I'm following the principles. I'm following the true con principles. I just read the Constitution. And he had this determination to just be committed to respectability and principles, which is always a bad sign, especially among Republicans, because these are the sign of people who run the Lincoln Project and have no principles at all, but they're just out for respectability. People didn't understand that. So do you think the conservative judge strategy has been a success or a failure?
I mean, they've appointed several hundred judges because there were all those vacancies. And there was that Frontline documentary sometime last year, I think, and then they re-released it recently on sort of the battle of the Supreme Court over the last 30 odd years since Bork. The subject of the documentary was McConnell, really. And they were trying to make this point that Mitch McConnell has this dastardly mastermind plan to take over the courts and take over the country with the Federalist Society. And it's a little far-fetched. But I do see it as interesting that this has been one of the few places where the conservatives have actually had meaningful victory and potentially long-term victory, at least for the next few decades. And it'll be interesting to see if, I'm not saying Biden will win. I don't want to be put on Distop's list, but
our listeners have no idea.
They have no idea what that is.
There is Distop is going to be frightened. We can't reveal necessarily who Distop is, but he's there's a very mysterious, very powerful figure out there who is threatening people who are doubting Trump's election, and he's going to put them on his list. What will happen to people on this list? We don't know, but we can't reveal too many details about it.
Yeah, and so I think that I'm not saying Biden will win, but if in the future, the Democrats do seize more power again, they're sort of setting the stage for this new line of attack. The way that they set the stage the other day with the gays are born this way stuff in the Senate. Kamala started this line of attack during the vice presidential debates, which I guess we're going to get into, but she said, she brought up that no one of color has been appointed under Trump's watch to any of these judgeships. No Black people. And this thus justifies the court packing, is the diversification agenda. And so it'll be interesting to see if all the Republican victories and all the Republican scheming to get these court appointees pushed through and to try and remake the court system and try and pass through a lot of commercial and civil legislation and so forth will be undone via the diversification agenda, which basically justifies stripping people of their judgeships or just court packing or creating new courts and new judgeships from thin air to give more representation to certain people. And I think that it's very possible that they could do that. They could end up completely flipping this on its head and just creating an overabundance of judges in every single facet, including the Supreme Court. And they will do it with the diversification method, and it'll all be, screeching black ladies and so on. That seems to be what could undo the Republicans, is that they did play by the rules. They played fair, as they always try and do. They waited very patiently for all these court appointships to come up, and then they took advantage of it. But I don't think that they ever really understood that if they don't find a way to deal with the Democrats long term, they're not going to be able to really reap the benefits of all of their patience and planning, because the Democrats are already showing that they're just going to completely augment the entire court system if they feel it's necessary. And the cause du jour for it will be a humanitarian one, which will be anti-racism, which the Republicans have a very hard time fighting against. They have a very hard time dealing with these sort of anti-racist charges.
Yeah, I agree. And I think they're going to go totally full board with court packing and other measures that, is going to entirely shape their country. But I don't necessarily think the conservative judge strategy has been a failure. I think it's very easy to complain about it. But from what the stated objectives of the Federalist Society of, trying to defend the Second Amendment, defend certainly from the perspective of business interests, they've been very successful. But even without the Federalist Society and them giving these conservative lawyers to be appointed to federal judgeships, that you can only imagine how bad the courts would be without this factor. And you have to remember is that most of the original left-wing policies that were implemented by the courts. I mean, the Warren Court imposed desegregation and eliminated prayer from school. Of course, Roe v. Wade was imposed by the court. So the courts prior to this conservative warfare strategy on the courts and trying to make sure that they're putting conservative jurists in these positions, the courts are terrible. And you can only imagine the situation we'd be in without that. We'd likely not have gun rights. There'd probably be hate speech laws enacted. Open borders clauses would be defended by the Supreme Court, as a lot of lower courts are trying to claim.
Hate speech seems to be the one that I think that they'll go for first from a court level, because it's the ultimate law enforcement measure that they can utilize. Hate speech, if they model it after some of the European states, like the French have these, and the English, oh my God, they have horrific hate speech laws in place where you can serve multiple years in prison. And it creates a way of patrolling and controlling the population that nothing else quite does. I actually think that a more, quote, progressive court will be pro-surveillance, and it will be pro-hate speech legislation and hate speech laws. And it will be an inverse of everything the progressive, movement tried to stand for. I'm thinking even just as recently as 7 years ago with Snowden, right? Yeah. Where they became very anti-surveillance. They got associated with the EEF and all these groups who were talking about the problems of mass surveillance and all these technologies that were being utilized to control speech patterns. They've abandoned all that. all those positions are no longer their top priority. Their priority is now climate change and racism. And so I could actually see a progressive takeover of the court system being pro surveillance. And again, the cause du jour will be anti-racism, and it'll be coupled with hate speech laws, and it'll be coupled with enforcement of hate speech. And very quickly, you know, there will be a mass surveillance dragnet that will be out in the open and will no longer be operated through these like obscure FISA courts with these obscure judges and all this sort of stuff. It'll just be out in the open that everyone's being surveilled all the time in order to prevent hate speech. And that will be the kind of new wave of progressive court making. Will be trying to expand the surveillance state, expand the anti-racism stuff. And I expect that the climate change shit is going to be their other top priority. And it's really about like, we're going to go after every oil.
Exxon and every oil, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to go after, and that's actually funny, you know, ExxonMobil, remember when they were accused of running the world? Now they're like blue chip stock. But yeah, you know, they're going to go after every small time oil and natural gas producer in the country. They're going to go after a lot of the chemical makers. They're going to go after a lot of private landowners and private foresting companies. And, you know, suddenly you're going to see this, certain kinds of cases will be brought before these courts and will be decided a certain way very quickly. And it'll basically ensure that the progressives, you know, they can direct the economic flow of the country just through the courts. I think that it's also interesting that the courts are becoming like the primary power center of America because everything else is so divided and sclerotic and corrupt, that the courts are where power is actually made and where laws are effectively now being made. It's very, very strange inverse, I think, of what was intended, where, you know, the courts are there to interpret and make maybe small jurisprudential decisions. But now the Supreme Court is effectively a legislator. And, you know, the real fight for electing, in theory, the legislators on paper is so that they then can appoint and fight over the real legislators, which is the Supreme Court, federal appellate courts. And
Yeah, and Hirono herself was making that point by essentially demanding Barrett be a legislator, and she's like, I'm a justice, I'm not a legislator, it's your job. And whenever she said, well, it's like Congress's job to do that, and Hirono was outraged that like, no, you have to legislate on this. And everyone knows the courts are the final, as you were saying, are the final say and the real power base. And I don't think this conservative strategy of just getting as many conservative justices as possible in there is terrible. Is that this is going to be the only bulwark against leftism if Biden wins, is the courts. And I don't know if Biden will actually manage to get court packing and a lot of these radical ideas through, because you do have to have a certain president with a lot of energy and a lot of charisma who has the popular will behind him. And Biden is generally just a geriatric who is being voted for against Trump. And they just want him to occupy the White House and just sit there. And there's going to be multiple competing factions within his administration. I don't even think most Democrats are going to be leery of this idea about court packing. I don't necessarily think they're going to have as many radical ideas that would require getting through Congress that would get passed through. And I can see people like Manchin and the few remaining moderates in in the Senate who would oppose court packing. So I don't necessarily know it would be a doomsday scenario. But with that said, conservative justices are going to be the main bulwark. It's not going to be Republicans in Congress. And yes, you do have disappointments like Neil Gorsuch going in, but that's more the fault of the Federalist Society not properly reviewing these justices on their immigration standards. I think he's been very bad on immigration, and the fact that people like that just want respectability. And that's necessarily the truth for most conservative lawyers, is that they want respectability and they are queasy about taking strong stands on issues that will deny them respectability.
How does immigration affect them? I mean,
True.
the effect towards them is minuscule. I mean, there will be some like externalities, right? Like rising crime, more pollution. There's little things, and it's very gradual. You don't notice it right away. It's sporadic. It does not affect them in the least, especially the kind of like mass, low scale, just sort of like riffraff immigration that we're really talking about here. That has like no bearing on their day-to-day life. So of course they're not going to be involved with it. I think this is part of the problem, is that we're assuming that professional lawyers have any sort of vested interest in the problems of low skill immigration. And they really don't, and I don't really understand why they would if they did. And so I think that this is ultimately kind of the pickle that we're now in, and that a system has been set up in such a way now where the Supreme Court, which is just professional lawyers, legal theorists, basically make huge rulings to decide the fate of the country any which way every given year. And none of these people are from some kind of like differing backgrounds. They don't have all these unique perspectives. They all come from the same legal societies. They all sometimes have shared the same professors. They come from the same 4 or 5 schools. There's no fundamental difference between them. Like, there's no fundamental difference between Kagan and Barrett on some level. I'm not saying that she's as bad as Kagan, but on some level, they are effectively the same people. They are upper class legal theorists.
Yeah, and on the conservatives desire the respect more from their liberal colleagues than their liberal colleagues demand respect from the conservatives.
That's just a perennial problem you have to deal with, and that conservatives, again, it goes back to this sort of strange paternalism that they've created for themselves. They see it as their duty to maintain this like respectability and this notion of good reputation and good lawmaking. And so now they're completely stuck, and they're unable to effectively legislate, even through the court, anything meaningful, because even though that they've worked their asses off to get these people on the court, there's no telling what these people on the court are actually going to do, because in the world of politics, they're no longer beholden to you. I mean, I'm sure that there were maybe handshake deals made or some demands made of Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, like, before you get in there, this is kind of what we would like you to rule on. But then they got them in there. So what exactly do they have over their heads that would make them still want to act that way? Like, now that Kavanaugh has won and he's in the court, he's done nothing but rule against a lot of Republicans on a lot of issues. And so I don't really understand why, other than he doesn't care anymore. He cared when he was trying to get in onto the bench, and now that he's on the bench, he's not beholden to them because he won. So there's this other issue of, you have these professional lawyers who are very concerned with themselves ultimately, and their own power and reputation. And whatever demands or deals you try and strike with them before they get on there, very good chance that they're just going to toss it and they're not going to follow it, unless they are some kind of like committed ideologue, which none of these people really are. Professional lawyers are not ideologues. They're never.
That's true. They're just out to, most of them are social climbers, and they don't want to risk anything that'll put them down the ladder. So yeah, this is definitely going to be an issue that's going to continue on for years and years to come. And of course, highly respected, we'll keep an eye on it. But moving on to a completely different subject. The other big news story is that domestic terrorists are out to kidnap Democratic governors. That's according to what the feds are telling us. The FBI apparently foiled a terror plot of the decade last week. 6 bumbling idiots in Michigan were just about to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, host a show trial against her, and topple the entire state government in the process. This is a 100% plausible plot that was definitely not hatched by a confidential federal informant and was believed by the entire media. They found this nutty plan sophisticated and real. And now we're once again told white supremacist militiamen are the greatest danger to the country, and Donald Trump is revving them up. What do you make of this case?
Well, I think multiple people in this group were federal informants. I think it's been confirmed 4 or 5 of them were. And
there's only like 6 of them arrested, and they always
Yeah.
thank the confidential informant. And
So-
it's already come out that the defense attorneys are saying this whole idea was suggested by the informant, and he
Yes.
pressured them into doing this, as is with all these cases, is that they're like, man, why are you being a pussy? You need to act now. You need to get violent. And they're like, hey, feds, here he is. There's a famous entrapment. I mean, this is totally an entrapment scheme. It demonstrates several factors of it, is that none of these guys had any ties to extremist groups. They weren't even in a militia. They were total idiots. The government had control of the situation. They kept moving Whitmer around, so they knew exactly what these guys were doing at all times, and they were controlling the situation. And if the defense attorneys are to believe, and they're probably right, is that this idea was hatched by the confidential federal informant himself, and he was the one pressuring them all to do this. And of course, they got them all arrested. And this resembles some of the entrapment scheme that Brandon Darby, who's now an editor of Breitbart, he used to be a leftist until he became a turncoat. When he brought a bunch of leftists to, I think it was the 2008 DNC in Minneapolis, or maybe it was the RNC in Minneapolis. It was one of the political conventions, was held there in 2008, and he encouraged these guys to engage in violence and attack police and building bombs and stuff. And he was like, what are you, a coward? Come on, man, we got to act. And of course, Brandon Darby turned all these nerdy leftists, and he's like, I saved the country, even though I clearly entrapped them. And this is probably another case, is that most of these publicized terror plots that are foiled, unless they are foiled by mistake, are generally the work of informants or federal agents entrapping some idiots into this. And then they go to the media, say that this was real and was about to happen, and thank God for our feds. And then the feds get their budget and they get their narratives confirmed, and everyone goes away happy.
Well, they do this every few years. Every few years, there's another FBI busts some dude before he does something scheme. It's like clockwork. And I remember they did it a few years ago with a retarded kid, which I thought was pretty cruel. The parents were just stunned. They're like, you realize he's mentally diminutive. He doesn't know what you're saying he was talking about. He doesn't know what that even means. He was just parroting. And I think that all got dropped. There was another one where this, I think 7-8 years ago, maybe earlier than that, but something like this, semi-teenager, 18, 19, had been talking with an FBI agent for months. FBI agent sends him bomb-making instructions, tells him what materials to get in what quantity at the freaking hardware store. The kid drives over to the New York Federal Reserve in the car with the bomb and is ready to detonate it, and then they bust him. It's like terror attack foiled on the New York Fed. And it came out, obviously, that the FBI had basically groomed this kid to go do this thing and told him how to do it. And then when he showed up to do it, they busted him.
Yeah.
And so this is a thing they do every few years. My assumption is that they find ways to reach out to people that they know are slightly deranged or just dumb and not able to discern what is obvious Fed posting or just weird behavior and overly aggressive behavior. And so these guys, this group of eclectic so-called militia members, they all of the ones who are not feds had very different political outlooks, had nothing to do with each other effectively. One of them is a goofy Reddit tier anarchist type. The other two are brothers that are friends with the county sheriff. It was just, the whole thing was very bizarre that they were grouped together. And it turns out, I think, that the so-called ringleader of the group is a Fed. And he was the one who hatched the idea to transport Whitmer across state lines into Wisconsin. And he picked this location. And so that's what, basically, the FBI agent who was pretending to be a militia member created the plan to do this, and then created the part of the plan that would have involved crossing state lines, which justify the FBI getting wiretap warrants, surveillance warrants, and then they surveil these guys, I believe.
Yeah.
So the FBI literally created this entire plot from scratch. Found working class Michiganders who were rightfully pissed off about the terrible economic catastrophe going on in the state under Whitmer. And clearly everyone's known about this. They've been surveilling these guys for like 5 or 6 months. This has been going on. So they chose these guys with this attempted crime. They hadn't actually done anything yet. And knows, I think, 2 of the brothers who were involved with it, said that he thinks that this is being blown out of proportion and that more than likely they weren't even attempting to kidnap her. They were probably attempting a citizen's arrest. And he cited a law in Michigan Civil Code where any citizen, any resident of Michigan and any citizen of the United States can perform a citizen's arrest on any other resident or, of Michigan citizen of the United States at any time of day that they so desire. And elected officials are not exempt from this. They are just as they can be arrested in a civilian's arrest. So his argument was that he knows these guys somewhat well, and he thinks that they're not like crazy militia loons, but more than likely they were pissed off about what's going on in Michigan. And they thought that they could perform a citizen's arrest on a Whitmer. We'll see if that holds up in court, but it is worth noting that the Michigan Supreme Court and the Michigan legislature have both found that Whitmer acted illegally and unconstitutionally and have forced her to rescind many of her orders. So she is, in some sense, a legal criminal. She has been found guilty of illegality. So they could also argue that in court, that these guys had every right to perform a citizen's arrest on the governor who was acting illegally. But
yeah,
I think
she's one of these many female petty tyrants that occupy the Democratic Party.
The best defense will be like the feds literally cooked up the entire plot. The federal agent created the entire scheme and convinced these guys to do it. That's the best defense.
And it supports all their narratives that the feds want to push. That one, that they're needed and important to block up all these domestic terror plots. That white right-wing extremists are the major threat to our country, not the left-wing extremists. And Gretchen Whitmer, who the Democrats still want to promote as like a heroic figure, despite all of her many failures and sending and wiping out nursing homes in Michigan, they still want to see her as a figure, even though with her, Botoxed face that makes her look like Caitlyn Jenner now. They're still going to promote her as like, this is a hero who survived a kidnapping plot. And we're still going to have to treat her as this great figure, even though I would say she's even worse than Kamala, which is, quite the achievement. So yeah, this is totally done. This is suspicious. This is clearly the Feds springing on October surprise. They want Trump gone, and they think that's, announcing this in October will maybe help their chances of getting Biden in. And then they can go back to setting up more of these entrapment schemes and going after their political enemies, which now lurk on the right. And there's, as you were saying before, is the left is really eager for this surveillance state that gives the FBI, CIA even more powers to go after, even citizens of our country. And they absolutely want Biden to go after anyone accused of being a white nationalist. And so they want these entrapment schemes, and they'll believe it. They will show no curiosity or any type of skepticism towards it, because we must believe our heroic deep state, whatever they say. And they do this stuff all the time. I mean, as you were saying earlier, there's this horrible Fed honeypot called the base, which was, some crazed neo-Nazis set it up. And there's a guy who was in Russia behind it. And this person was either working for Russian intelligence or American intelligence. It's still not clear, but this guy was somebody's Fed who set this up. And whether it was Russian trying to set up people to destabilize America in the most retarded way possible, or it was just a federal agent trying to entrap, idiotic kids. We're not clear, but there was like multiple informants besides the leader who were in this group, and there's like several hilarious stories. There was a guy in the group whose name was Yusuf, who was of Arab background, and a federal informant told him directly, "Hey, go vandalize a synagogue." And the guy went and did it on the informant's orders. And of course he got arrested. And they're like, yeah, the informant told him to do this. And the documents show this. And the informants were telling them to run paramilitary training camps and all this nonsense that was going on. And it's like a gigantic honeypot. And even the name of the group is the English name of Al Qaeda. It was like the most like low effort, attempt to create a fake terrorist group. And it of course attracted, dim-witted idiots and, social outcasts who spent way too much time online. And they got into this and they're like, we've got to do something. And of course, now they're all doing something in jail. So you're going to see far more groups like this, or even groups that were created by idiots who are like the base, and then they just attract feds who are then just arresting people left and right and using it to justify their own budgets. And they definitely want our government to go after these groups. They're definitely going to have to create these groups and staff them with members, because I think most people have now gotten the message that if you join a group that's going out and skull mass and paramilitary, doing paramilitary training and threatening terrorism and celebrating mass shooters, that the feds are going to come in and they're going to find any way to arrest you. And any person with, an IQ over 85 will hopefully get that message. But, they're going to try and do these groups more and more, even under Trump, unfortunately. And it's just the nature of our world, because the new enemy isn't Islamic terrorism. It's really the historic American nation. And they need to create these terror groups so they can suppress the base that made Trump president. And they will use these terror groups to demand, more speech censorship, more scrutiny of ordinary conservative or right-wing groups. They're going to all use their 501c3 status just because of some idiot and group that will call itself like Nazi terror group, because they're like generic name. We'll just call it Nazi terror group. And that's the way the world's going to work now.
Well, I do think it's also interesting. I think O'Keefe busted some fat weirdo from Colorado who was talking about, killing Nazis and bootlickers in the street. Some left-wing guy. This guy has his own 501c3 called Our Revolution or something like that. And here he is, giving speeches to groups of people very candidly and grinning while he does it, talking about guillotining, or he calls slicey boys, or all this shit for like random people, the bootlickers and Republicans, and a lot of people have to die. We have to seize by force. And he was bragging about how many guns he has. And, I was actually thinking to myself watching this, there is like an 80% chance this guy is a Fed. And O'Keefe accidentally busted either a Fed or like a Fed informant, because he is just a total loon. And there's just no way anyone is going to be that open with talking about like getting guns and handing them out from his gun safe to random people to kill other random people. Like, it was just insane.
I will push back on that. I think with the left, this is very common. If you go on Twitter, you'll see them celebrating guillotines and mass violence all the time. And anytime these Project Veritas videos where they go and interview a leftist, I think they were doing this against Bernie Sanders volunteers. All the Bernie Sanders mid-level volunteers were gleeful about the prospect of executing conservatives and like shooting them and putting them in prison camps. So these are very common aspects about it, and there's not really any social consequences for them Fed posting and them imagining mass genocide against white people. They're never going to lose their job. They're not going to get censored on Twitter. They're not even going to. It's like almost. They'll almost be unfortunate enough if they'll get a federal, like a police visit for some of these threats. And I think this is very common because there's not anyone who has to tell them to stop Fed posting because there's not any federal attention towards them, as we're seeing in how the feds are just letting them run riot while the FBI has probably had like 100 agents on these 6 idiots in Michigan. While they're like, oh, we can't find out who's, helping out these rioters, but we did get these rednecks who otherwise wouldn't have posed a harm to anyone without our confidential informants pushing them in that direction. So I think maybe that guy is a Fed. That could be the case. But
or if he's not, it's interesting that like they're paying zero attention to this sort of stuff, and they're just
they are. I mean, well, I think they know that the left does not challenge their budget. It's not challenging their authority, and they just don't care. They see these people on their side, and there's not a social stigma attached to left-wing violence or left-wing genocidal fantasies. Like, nobody will lose their job for like threatening to guillotine people. And even when they went out in front of like Bezos's house, and they've done this at a few other places, and they'll set up a guillotine, nobody cares. Like, literally no one cares. And it's the same with these Project Veritas videos where they were interviewing these Bernie Sanders, campaign staffers who I don't even think lost their jobs for saying that, like, I can't wait to, start murdering Trump supporters. I can't wait to put them in a prison camp that they'll never leave. They don't care. There's not a social stigma around it like there is with right-wing violence. Well, even if you say it's the same with like social media. If you even say you support Kyle Rittenhouse, you can risk getting banned. But if you say you hope Kyle Rittenhouse gets tortured to death and so is his entire family, you're not going to get censored at all.
Right. Yeah.
So that's just the nature of it.
You made a good point just there about the budgets. Like in the COVID era, when there's a lot of talk of, budgetary cuts to just about every kind of law enforcement office for various reasons. I do think it's interesting the FBI is ensuring that their budget will not be cut. That maybe even raised. They might even get a budget boost. They're going to chit-chat about how much right-wing terrorism they need to prevent. And I'm sure that if this doesn't stick or this gets blown out in court, they'll just come up with a more convincing plot in 6 months or a year, because they need to keep up this myth that there is just this effervescence of terror plots being targeted or plotted all the time. And without the watchful eye of the FBI, we would be seeing these things every day. If you remember, the FBI was like adequately warned by multiple foreign intelligence agencies about those dipshit Tsarnaev brothers, the Chechens. And the FBI even interviewed and surveilled, allegedly, the older one for some period of time in Boston. And yet didn't find enough to bring him in or to keep surveillance on him for an extended period of time. If they had, they could have very likely prevented what he did. Now, the FBI will not prioritize actionable intelligence from multiple foreign governments that, okay, these guys are up to something. This older brother is a huge weirdo. He's traveling back and forth to Chechnya. He's talking with known Islamic radicals, known people who have, instructed others to make bombs and commit crime. You need to look at him. And the FBI kind of shrugged their shoulders and didn't even put in so much as, a month's effort into the older Tsarnaev brother.
Yeah.
And so they will purposefully ignore actionable intelligence on real domestic terror plots, but they will create fictional domestic terror plots when there's not enough domestic terror plots going on. I mean, up to this point, when was the last big Islamic terror attack or big right-wing terror attack or
in 2017 we had 2 Islamic terror. There was a guy who drove a car through busy crowds in New York City, and there was another person who was placing bombs around New York City. And that guy, the bomber, would have actually done a lot more damage, but it was like a total accident. Like a homeless man happened upon his bombs on the train track, and I think there was another like homeless person who also happened upon his bombs in another busy city street. And this saved a lot of people, and it was nothing due to the feds, because most of the terrorists now are just lone wolves, either mass shooters or these guys who are just deciding to drive a car through a crowd. And we've largely forgotten these 2 terror attacks, and we just focus on Charlottesville, which is the worst event to ever happen in U.S. history besides George Floyd's ODing. And so we don't have, I mean, you do have these mass shooters who will have any ideology, or just maybe they just want to kill people. And you do have all these maniacs who are out there, but there's nothing the feds can do about that, because usually these people are keeping it to themselves unless they're sharing it on a chat forum. There's no way of noticing. And all they really do is just they release their manifesto as they're about to enter Walmart, and the feds are incapable of doing this. So the type of elaborate terror plots that we saw with 9/11 and the first World Trade Center bombing and all the ISIS attacks that were happening in Europe in 2015 and 2016, it's probably unlikely we're going to see those again, because just all these networks are infiltrated by so many federal informants, and they just have to make up terror attacks or terror plots to continue their budgets and to continue the narratives they want to push. But they're powerless to stop mass shooters, which is the real domestic danger, and it's how they claim that white supremacists are the real problem in our country because of all these mass shooters. But they also are incapable of doing anything about Antifa, which is clearly organized. Clearly, there are agent provocateurs who are out there who can create a riot just with a van, showing up and distributing materials and distributing training. But the feds seem to have no concern for that, so they'll just make up more terror plots. But this is definitely a topic we're going to see a lot more of in the coming years, and we'll definitely keep an eye on it. But we're going to have to wrap it up with the final, of course, highly respected Patreon questions. This one comes from Tom. He asked me, Scott, what did you think of the vice presidential debates? Well, it was rather boring and tame compared to the presidential debates. I think Mike Pence did a pretty good job. The more interesting aspect about it was the response of Mike Pence trying to assert himself, and then Kamala being like, Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. Hello, I'm speaking. It's me. I'm speaking. And it was a way that was like a second grader. A lot of this stuff is like they always act like elementary school tyrants, are teachers who just suck. And, it's like somebody like you're in class, like, I don't think that's right. And it's like, excuse me. I'm the teacher. I'm the one speaking, and I'm the authority here. And of course, like Mike Pence respectfully trying to assert himself and make points was counted as mansplaining, because women are incapable of conducting a debate without sexism or misogyny accusations emerging. So that's what it is. I think it did expose Kamala Harris as totally unlikable, and that this is why she lost the primary bad. And she really cannot win a presidential election on her own. She's just not a person that anyone would like. And the media has to foist her on us and like say, oh, she's just so great. She's an immigrant, a child of immigrants, and she's just so powerful and badass, and we love her. But it's astroturf. Like, ordinary Americans don't like that. They much prefer Mike Pence, and he came across that. But yeah, I'm excited for the upcoming presidential debates. Hans, you got any additional thoughts on that?
I think it just went to show how terrible Kamala really is. She is just the most annoying, ugly person in modern American politics. And I think that immediately after the debate, I didn't even watch the full debate because I knew what it was going to be. And I honestly can't stand listening to Kamala for more than like 30 seconds without, moving around in my chair and just like feeling like I need to take a shower. Right after the debate, though, this narrative came up of mansplaining. Mike Pence was mansplaining to Kamala Harris all night. And the impression I got from that was, man, this is serious cope.
Yes.
And I immediately realized, like, oh my God, they must have some kind of internal polling, or they must be using common sense. Like, this woman came off as so unappealing to everyone, literally everyone, except for wine ants, I guess. She came off as rude, unprepared, not smart, and arrogant all at the same time.
Yes.
And they need to try and concoct whatever theory they can as to why the debate went the way it did. And because, honestly, she doesn't have very thoughtful answers or retorts to anything. I made this point before. Kamala Harris is not a real politician. She's not a seasoned politician. Kamala Harris is a social climber who happens to have stumbled upon the office of senator at this stage, and is very quickly trying to stumble upon the office of the vice presidency and then the presidency very quickly thereafter. I mean, she's just sort of jumping very rapidly from one position to another. She's not a seasoned debater. I don't think she's ever had to debate a Republican before, because she comes from California. And so she essentially exists to act as like a brand for whoever her controllers are. And she doesn't ever really have to be questioned or fight for her position or do anything meaningful. Again, she's a U.S. senator, so she just kind of blows off steam all day. But the moment you put her in a room with a seasoned Republican politician, suddenly she's revealed as being woefully inept in how to debate and how to have a conversation and how to argue and articulate her ideas. She didn't really understand how to articulate any of her ideas, I think. And I think that she probably is part of the reason why Biden's going to sink, because she is just so loathsome, and she proved it. And I haven't seen anything out of her since that debate. She's like basically vanished outside of the show trials going on for
Amy Coney Barrett.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything out of her, and I think that she has basically been told, "You are now an invisible part of this campaign because you performed so terribly the other night, and you're a liability because you look insane." And that's not what we're going for. We're not going for the insane kind of wine ant vote. We're going for the Midwestern, like working class fracking vote, and that's not you. So I think that they went as well as you could expect for Pence, which was Kamala Harris revealed who she really is, which is an insane, petty tyrant who doesn't really believe in anything. Called herself a person of faith. Whatever.
Yeah, that was the
that
biggest
means.
lie of all time.
Yeah.
I don't think, as I tweeted out, that's a bigger lie than her liking Tupac in college. I mean, it's and Tupac, of course, was not releasing albums when she was in college, but yeah, it's such a lie. And there's clearly she had no faith. And the way she said it was like an arrogant, like, excuse me, we're people of faith. It's like saying like your wife's asking, are you cheating? It's like, oh no, how can you dare say this, accusing me of, as you're like texting your mistress at the same time.
I'm a person of marriage,
Yeah, I'm a person of marriage. So yeah, I think I would agree with you. It exposed her as a petty tyrant, and as unlikable. But this is the type of female politician that Democrats are supporting. And I think my hot take is I don't think we'll ever have, unless Biden wins the election and somehow he dies in office. I don't know how we're going to get a female candidate to become president, because the type of women who rise up to our highest echelons in politics are too unlikable and have so many negative qualities that they're grating to the American public. And I don't see how any of them can. Looking at the crop of them. I think it's going to be, everyone says that we're going to have a female candidate or female president rather soon. I actually don't think so. I think it'll be a long time coming. I don't see anybody becoming president in 2024, barring, of course, and dying in office, or if he wins, and then Kamala assuming the powers that are invested in the White House. So that's the only way I see that. But otherwise, you know, it is what it is. Democrats enjoy the female petty tyrants, but they don't necessarily want them to be president. And with that, that's all the time we have today. So Hans, plug in what you want our good listeners to support and find.
Well, I'm part of the Myth of the 20th Century podcast. This week, we're discussing Juan Perón in Argentina. So feel free to check us out, myth20c.wordpress.com. We're on BitChute and a couple other places. And yeah, that's, I think, all I really have to plug these days.
Awesome. Well, it's always great to have you. And you may have more appearances than Nightmare Vision now. So that's something to put on your belt. You know, you can really tout that to your grandchildren. You should, not just your resume. It's something that your grandchildren and great-grandchildren will look up to. But with that note, thanks for coming on the podcast. We always appreciate you appearing.
Thank you for having me, Scott. It's always a pleasure.
And you're welcome. And until next time, stay respected.